Year 10 and 11, welcome to your revision on the theme of poverty in A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens in preparation for your English literature exam. First of all then, before we do anything, we need to understand the poor law. If you check out my video on the context of A Christmas Carol, it's all on there, but we can go over it now. So basically in 1834, the Poor Law Amendment was passed by Parliament. You can get this on BBC Bitesides, this little section. This was designed to reduce the cost of looking after the poor, as it stopped money going to poor people, except in exceptional circumstances. If people wanted help, they had to go into a workhouse to get it. The poor were given clothes and food in the workhouse in exchange for several hours of manual labour each day. Families were split up inside the workhouse. People had to wear a type of uniform, follow strict rules, were on a bad diet of bread and watery soup, and conditions were made so terrible that only those people who desperately needed help would go there. And don't forget that Dickens had his own experience with the workhouse as well. So a lot of his messages within A Christmas Carol and poverty centre around that. More simply, because Dickens had his own personal experience with poverty, he was annoyed and upset about the way society treated the poor, and this idea that society didn't care about the welfare of the poor or how they were treated. Dickens therefore creates this extensive allegory throughout his novella, and he delivers a message to the public. He uses Scrooge as a symbol of the wealthy and aristocratic members of society who are ignorant of the misfortunes of the poor. Dickens goes as far as possible to show how cold and unforgiving Scrooge is towards lower class men and lower class people in general. Scrooge shows his uncaring attitude, especially at the beginning of the novella, when he gives us this lengthy tirade about the poor and the prisons and the workhouses. I'm going to come to this in a moment. And it shows us that the poor are neglected. Okay? Using Scrooge, Dickens calls for a moral change in the wealthy. He wanted the people that could change society to act. A little bit more. Charles Dickens brings to life the two traits that mankind will apparently inherit, the ignorance of the wealthy and the want of the poor. So you know when those two children come around, and one's called ignorance and one is called want. Now, metaphorically, ignorance and want are the children of mankind, as is rightly said in the novella. As the children of mankind, they represent the traits that will filter through generations because of the poor quality of life that cannot change because of the negligence of the wealthy. Okay? Scrooge asks the spirit if they were his and receives the following answer. They are man's, said the spirit, looking down upon them, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom. Unless the writing be erased, deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out its hand towards the city. Slander those who tell it ye, admit it for your factious purposes, and make it worse and by the end. And that massive quote, I don't expect you to remember it, not at all, but we can remember doom. Notice that doom there is also personified with your capital D. And in this quotation, this is sending Dickens's message, the message he's trying to deliver to the public, that the wealthy must change their ways for the betterment of society. Notice as well that he warns, beware of the boy. Yes, the boy is ignorance. So this is Dickens's whole purpose and his whole message to the wealthy, that being ignorant of the poor will result in doom. And doom is twofold here. It is the doom of Scrooge himself, potentially, and it is the doom, obviously, of society. Scrooge is not concerned or interested about the plight of the poor at the beginning, as we know this. And further than this, he believes that his taxes pay for the prisons and the workhouses, so therefore he doesn't donate money to charity. Quote, are there no prisons? Asked Scrooge. Then another quote, and the union workhouses, demanded Scrooge. And then he goes on about the poor law. The poor law in full vigour then, said Scrooge. So we see his attitude straight away in chapter 1, and that foreshadows potentially what could happen because of his actions. And also, I suppose it's what has happened to Marley, his business partner, as well, isn't it? And as we know, the conditions in the workhouses we've just discussed were despicable. The conditions in the prisons were as well. So it's almost as if he thinks the poor should be punished for being poor. And then even worse than all that, if that's possible, he even suggests that poor people should die to decrease the surplus population. Okay, so Dickens overemphasises Scrooge's views of the poor, obviously because he's trying to send this message to the public. So try and remember those quotations there. Dickens' own childhood experiences of poverty influenced him, and he worked very hard for financial security. Scrooge's harsh views lead him to exploit and mistreat people, for instance Bob Cratchit. And Belle explains that Scrooge lives in fear of poverty, much like Dickens himself, and she goes on to explain that he is captivated by gain. Notice again that that is personified with your capital G, hoping to escape the sordid reproach of poverty. Scrooge himself says there is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty. So he's petrified of being poor, a little bit like Dickens, because Dickens had experienced the workhouse. Now, so far we've had the personification of ignorance, the personification of want, the personification of doom, the personification of gain. And we're having all of these characteristics, these human characteristics outlined to us, and a lot of them are portrayed negatively, particularly gain and ignorance. Obviously, he uses the book to show us the unfair treatment of the poor. Dickens appears to criticise the government because remember when some of the phantoms are going past the window in chapter 1, there's a suggestion that it might be the guilty government. So now we have Dickens criticising the establishments that are in charge of the country. We wonder if he's criticising the government's treatment of the poor and the poor law itself. And he probably is. And the fact that they're in chains is significant here. Much like Marley, it's a result of an uncaring mistreatment of the poor, that they are chained up, that they are trapped. Also, the Ghost of Christmas Present criticises the bigotry and selfishness of those who supported Sabbatarianism. I hope I've said that right, I might not have. And Dickens is yet again attacking the restrictions placed on the poor. Now, I don't know if you do the poem London by William Blake, but it's similar in that instance. We have Dickens criticising religion and the restrictions placed on people there, and we have Dickens criticising the government, and that's exactly what William Blake does in the poem London, if you do that. Now, if you don't know what Sabbatarianism is, I hope I've said that right, I probably haven't, then I've just put a star on the bottom there. Now, it was a Victorian practice to spend Sunday going to church and resting, and Dickens was against this because it meant that poor people were denied enjoyment on their day off. It's as if they were being dictated to again and restricted again. So it's another thing that Dickens, I suppose, is criticising about society at the time. Quotations off there you want to remember is guilty government, the bigotry and selfishness, obviously, of religion. Living conditions then. Many people moved from the country to the city to look for work, and therefore the population grew. It actually grew from 1 million to 6 million, the population of London. Now, obviously, that's going to result in problems. Most of the people ended up living in slums or cheap, overcrowded houses. Overcrowding led to hunger, disease and crime. Key quotation from the book is reeked with crime, with filth and misery. Look at your triple there for language analysis. Crime, filth, misery. Okay? So that, you know, so some parts of this city, and I'm going to come to that later as well, are disgraceful. Joe's shop particularly, again, I'll be coming to that later on. So we're seeing that the conditions that the poor people had to exist in, besides the workhouses and the prisons, it was filth, there was disease, there was crime, they were starving. Why? Because it's overpopulated. Children obviously suffered the most and were therefore exploited by wealthy factories and made to work in long, appalling conditions. And again, another quotation about the poor. Many thousands are in want of common necessity. Oh my God, I can't say it. You know what I mean? Now, if you look there, the things we want to analyse in terms of language are thousands. That's not just a few. Want, because we get the child of want later on representing what the poor need. But the sad thing about this quotation is they don't want for much. They just want things that are common, everyday things. Probably, you know, things like clean water and food and things like that. Apologies, I can't say necessaries. You know what I mean. Now, we're going to move to Thomas Malthus. Again, my pronunciation will probably be off there. Now, he claimed that population would always grow and grow faster than the food supplies. And this would result in many people, more so the poor, dying. He argued that poverty was inevitable and people should have families later in life and people really shouldn't have a lot of children. Now, Dickens disagreed with him. He thought there was enough food to go around if the rich were generous and shared. And in chapter 3, the description of the shops and the food emphasises Dickens' point. Okay? Ignorance and want, then, as we said before, the children of mankind, and they're described as horrible. Look at your adjective there for language analysis. 2 traits that are horrible to mankind, that are horrible to human beings, that will wreak havoc with society. The suggestion is that these traits are the creation of society because of their treatment of the poor. And we get, from the foldings of its robes it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. That quote there, miserable, links back to the description we've just had of the living conditions being filthy and miserable. Look at the adjectives used: wretched, frightful, hideous. Okay, so they are a direct representation of these human characteristics, these traits that Dickens was trying to get us to avoid. The massive quote is here. I don't expect you to remember it, but let's just have a look. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility, where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints. A steel and shrivelled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade. Through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Now, again, in terms of your analysis, if we could remember a couple of things here, that will be good enough. So we've got that there, ragged, wolfish. So it's almost like an animalistic quality, that we shouldn't have these traits of being ignorant. Because it potentially will ruin society. We've got this idea that where angels might have sat, devils lurked. Well, we know what we associate with devils. We associate devils with hell, don't we? We associate the devil with the fall down of mankind, the downfall of man himself. So again, Dickens here is playing clever and warning us about the potential downfall of mankind, the downfall, the warning to Scrooge of what's going to happen if he continues in his way of being ignorant and ignoring the poor and not helping them when he can. And this idea that we've got monsters, wolfish, horrible, it's a depiction of human traits that we really should avoid. Social responsibility then. The ghost of Christmas present warns that ignorance will lead to doom. So doom is personified there, as I've just mentioned. The doom of Scrooge himself and society overall. And Dickens thinks the lack of education received by the poor should be addressed. So the poor should be educated properly. And Tiny Tim is obviously the most obvious connection between poverty and death, isn't it? Scrooge saves him, and herein lies the message of social responsibility. The rich can make a difference to the lives of the poor. Marley sets out a clear warning in chapter 1 for Scrooge. He says, mankind was my business, the common welfare was my business, charity, mercy, forbearance and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. So through this metaphor, he outlines that he had the wrong concerns, that his business, as he says, is a drop in the ocean. It means very little. He says there that mankind should have been his business, that he should have been concerned with charity and mercy and benevolence, characteristics that we should all have in terms of making society a better place, helping those in times of need. Again, this is not totally dissimilar to an Inspector Calls if you do that. The Cratchits are the face of poverty in the novella. Mrs. Cratchit dresses in ribbons, but they actually represent her desperation to look respectable and nice, and we get brave in ribbons. Peter is wearing a second-hand coat and is described as gallantly attired. Again, look, that they're always positive even though they're poor. So Mrs. Cratchit is brave and Peter is gallantly there. And again, it's this subtle message that they might not be rich in terms of finance, but they are rich in terms of family, companionship, emotion, spiritual. They're rich in ways that Scrooge isn't. Their pudding is described as small. Nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. So obviously we can surmise there that the pudding probably won't feed everybody, but no one would dare be ungrateful. And the Ghost of Christmas Present warns that if things don't change, if these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. So if the Cratchits continue to live in poverty and are ignored by Scrooge, then the price of that is Tiny Tim's death. So actually we get a serious message in here via Dickens in terms of if we continue to ignore those who are less fortunate, then death is the price here, that they are suffering so much that they will die. 19th century conditions we've touched on, but there's some quotations to prove it. So poverty is emphasised in Joe's shop where Scrooge's stolen possessions are. We get foul and narrow. Look at that adjective, foul. It links back to earlier what we said about disease. Like so many cesspools disgorge their offences of smell and dirt. Again, look, like a cesspool, and it's dirty. So again, Dickens is educating us or showing us or outlining to us the conditions that poor people had to live in. The people are described as half naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Half naked as if they can't dress themselves, I suppose. Almost very subtly links back to the Cratchits. Drunken, again, leads to this, I suppose, seedy idea of what the city is like. Ugly reminds us of ignorance and want in the way that they were described. Now, the poor people as well have stolen possessions from Scrooge's corpse, and they don't care. They're not embarrassed. They don't feel remorse. So we're getting a depiction of the 19th century living conditions for the poor as something quite disgraceful, really. Beyond humane, isn't it? Rich versus poor is shown in other ways as well. So as I've mentioned, the Cratchits are poor but appreciate what they have. Sorry, I've put a typing error there. I've put E-hat. My mistake. They appreciate what they have. They don't need money because they're emotionally rich. Now, the opposite of that is Scrooge. Scrooge is rich in terms of money, but poor in relation to family, friends, and emotions. So the Cratchits and Scrooge act as binary opposites. Yeah, they are the antithesis of one another. Fred actually says about Scrooge that his wealth is of no use to him. And that's an interesting line, isn't it? Because he doesn't use it for good. He's solitary, as we know. He's alone, and he's greedy. Fred also explains how Christmas never gave him money, but it made him richer emotionally and spiritually. And again, this is another one of Dickens's messages here, isn't it? About family. If you need anything on family, watch my video on that. And Fezziwig is also emotionally rich and uses his wealth to make others happy. So that was your quick revision on poverty with the background. Please check out my other videos. There's Scrooge, there's family, there's the context, and massive good luck in your English literature exam.